There have been a lot of great babyfaces in wrestling. Names like Dusty Rhodes, Steve Austin, and John Cena come to mind immediately. And on the flip side, there have also been plenty of great heels, such as Ric Flair, Roddy Piper, or Bobby Heenan. On occasion, though, you get a performer who is great at playing both sides of the spectrum, someone who's just as great at being a hero as they are at being a villain. But who are the best examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we are going to be looking at right now, starting with Shawn Michaels. Yes, we all know how great of a babyface the Heartbreak Kid was during his second run with WWE during the 2000s. Hell, despite being one of the older wrestlers on the roster at the time, and despite him still to some degree recovering from the effects of the back injury which had, for a while, forced him into retirement, he remained so over with fans as a hero that he was always near or at the top of the card. But then this ability to get people on his side was nothing new, as back during his very early days as one half of the Rockers alongside Marty Jannetty, he was about as pure of an on-screen babyface as they came. That said, as anyone who watched him during the late 90s will remember, there was also a different side to Shawn. And that was a side of himself he frequently tapped into at this point in his life, with it going a long way towards making him the biggest heel on the WWF roster. Need someone who could stand as a foil to Stone Cold Steve Austin during his initial chase for the WWF title? Then HBK was your man. All of this is to say then that no matter what side of the alignment chart he was on, Shawn Michaels was always one of the best in the world at his job, maybe the best outright. And it's for that reason that he remains so highly regarded today. Sure, we might not see much of that old heel showstopper in his current role as NXT General Manager, but we're pretty sure if that brand ever needed a heel GM to stand in opposition to someone like Trick Williams or Roxanne Perez, then Shawn would still be able to pull it off. But what of the yin to HBK's yang, the man who is so closely intertwined with him, Bret Hart? Well, he's our next subject as it happens, because he's another person who, over the years, proved himself to be just as good at being the bad guy as he was at being the good guy. Not that this was always evident, though. No, despite playing the heel during part of his run with the Hart Foundation during the 80s, by the time the mid-90s came around, the Hitman had become such a popular act amongst fans, it was hard to imagine him being anything other than a babyface. After all, he's the guy who was so over, he was chosen as the replacement for Hulk Hogan when the Hulkster left WWF in 1993. And for the next few years, this would be a role Bret would continue to fill with pride, whether he was the top guy or not, as he always served as a role model for young children all over the world. Come 1997, though, things were starting to change, and a new idea of a hero was beginning to rise in fans' minds, with this new hero being perfectly personified by the anti-heroic antics of Stone Cold Steve Austin. So feeling like fans were unjustly turning on him in favor of the Rattlesnake then, Hart would undergo the most justified heel turn of all time, one which saw him completely transform his character and go on an arguably career-best run. Yes, of all the things the Hitman did during his illustrious career, it's possibly his time as the leader of the Hart Foundation in 1997 which stands above all. And it's this one which continues to serve as an inspiration for modern-day acts like Drew McIntyre. So never let it be forgotten that for as great of a babyface as Bret Hart was, he was just as good of a heel and should always be considered one of the rare few who pulled off both to perfection. But then when you're talking about the excellence of execution, this should go without saying. After all, he is the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. But let's move away from the 90s for a moment and onto a more recent example of someone who's done great work as both a face and a heel. Someone who goes by the name of Randy Orton. That's right, like with Shawn Michaels in the 90s, Randy Orton's real-life personality during the 2000s made him the most natural heel in the business. And this led to much success for him throughout that decade. Success which included, but was not limited to, multiple world title runs and a WrestleMania main event. Sure, there would be periods back then when he was presented as a babyface, but these never really took at the time, mostly on account of the fact that it was too easy to boo Orton on account of him being a known trouble causer behind the scenes. After a while, though, things began to change for the Viper as he grew older, with this causing him to mellow out as a person and start to change his ways. And with this new attitude on life came an increased ability to play a convincing babyface on screen, something WWE took advantage of as the 2010s led into the 2020s. So that's given us a situation today when he can be either or, depending on what the situation calls for. Need a top babyface who can stand tall alongside Cody Rhodes and help him fight off the bloodline? Then Randy Orton is the perfect guy for the role. Alternatively, though, if you need someone who can tap into that old cold-blooded heel side of himself and act as a challenger for the champ, then he's also still got it in him. Hell, we're currently in the process of seeing this transformation happen on WWE TV right now, as in recent weeks, it's become more apparent that Orton has his eyes on the American Nightmare's WWE title. And if history has taught us anything, it's that he's bound to turn on Cody eventually, with this making him a villain in the eyes of fans once more. Until that happens, though, we'll be happy to watch him carry on with his honorable ways for a little while longer, as he is equally as good at playing such a role. Of course, Randy Orton isn't the only member of the current-day WWE roster who's great no matter what side of the alignment chart he's on, though. No, the exact same thing could be said about our next subject, too, as over on Raw, they've been showing this for years. Who are we talking about here? Why, Seth Rollins, of course. That's right, how could we not put Seth Rollins in today's video? After all, he's routinely succeeded in whatever role he's been given, whether that be as a hero or a villain. Even in his run as part of the Shield alone, he straddled both sides of the spectrum to perfection, as that group started out as the biggest heel act in the company, only for them to effortlessly segue to the other side only a year later. And it was him who went right back to being a heel again when he broke up the Hounds of Justice by laying out Roman Reigns with a steel chair on the Raw after Payback 2014, something which broke the hearts of many fans at the time. Obviously then, this move should have been enough to make him a heel for the rest of his career, as how could anyone ever trust him again following such a dastardly act? But in a testament to just how much skill the architect has at getting in touch with the emotions of fans, it would only be a couple of years after this that he'd be returning to the babyface side of the equation. And he wouldn't just be any old babyface at this point. No, he'd at times be the top babyface on all of Raw. Really, the truth of the matter is that it doesn't make a difference which alignment Seth Rollins has. He's always going to shine brightly, because his talent is so great, it would be impossible for him not to. And that all means we're likely going to see him continue to be one of the most focused upon acts in WWE for some time to come yet. Some of these times he's going to be playing the hero, of course, and some of those times he's going to be playing the villain, but regardless of which one it is, he's always going to be Seth Rollins, ace of Monday nights. Or who knows, maybe we'll see him show up somewhere else in the future and be a top guy there instead. Somewhere like a SmackDown, or maybe even a Dynamite, where he can once more show off how good he is at oscillating between being a babyface and a heel. And if Seth Rollins ever did find himself heading over to AEW for a spell, he might find himself once again coming into contact with an old co-worker of his, someone who's also had a long history of playing both the babyface and the heel, the one, the only, Chris Jericho. Yes, even if we're only talking about his All Elite Wrestling run alone, Chris Jericho has already shown how good he is at being both the hero and the villain, as during his 5 years there, he's gone from being the heelish leader of the Inner Circle to the babyface leader of a more fan-friendly Inner Circle, all the way back to his initial heel character again as the head honcho of both the Jericho Appreciation Society and the Learning Tree. But then his ability to oscillate between both sides with so much success should come as no surprise to anyone who's been following his career for any length of time, as this has been something he's been doing since way back in the 90s. After all, that was when we saw Y2J excel as not only the plucky young Lionheart, foreign star of Mexico, but also the heel character who was hated by so many in WCW. And it was also the decade we saw him first join WWF and use his Ayatollah of Rock and Rolla character to great effect in both light and dark incarnations. Then, as the 2000s and the 2010s came around, Jericho would continue to show his Madonna-esque ability to constantly reinvent himself by becoming Suit and Tie Jericho, a heel, and List Jericho, a heel who was secretly a babyface to half the audience, and who later officially became a babyface following the events of the Festival of Friendship. Yes, the reality is that there are few out there who are better than him at getting fans to either cheer him or boo him, depending on what the situation calls for. And with him not seeming to have any interest in hanging up his boots quite yet, we expect there's still a few years left of him switching things up on a regular basis. Could we see Chris Jericho as the two-time AEW World Champion before the decade is out, this time as a hero to the people? Anything's possible. In fact, we can't rule out the possibility he jumps back to WWE at some point too, and there chooses to finish his career. And if he does that, it would give him maybe his final opportunity to once more lock horns with an old rival of his, someone who's made their name by being one of the biggest babyfaces in wrestling history, but who was just as good at playing a heel when he was needed to as well, John Cena. Yes, for as much as John Cena wasn't beloved by the adult fans in attendance during the 2000s and 2010s, he was a huge babyface with younger audiences. And this meant he was always pushed as the ultimate hero, the guy who could overcome any obstacle put up against him by focusing on his three core tenets: hustle, loyalty, and respect. Basically, he was the closest thing Vince McMahon ever got to creating a new version of Hulk Hogan, the purest of American heroes without any hint of villainy or darkness in his soul. But then maybe there was still some of that villainy hidden in there deep down if you really wanted to find it. The villainy which came from when he was the Doctor of Thuganomics during the early 2000s. Who was the Doctor of Thuganomics? Well, this was the official bad guy run of John Cena, the one which first made him a star. So never let it be forgotten that before he was ever the ultimate good guy, Big Match John was just as adept at playing a heel who was designed to be a heel too. In fact, he was so good at this role that he eventually turned himself babyface in the eyes of live crowds, the fate of almost any great villain if enough time goes on with them in the role. It was certainly a fate which awaited our next subject when they first entered the wrestling industry back in 1996, and it didn't stop them from becoming one of the biggest stars the business has ever seen. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but the People's Champion himself, The Rock. That's right, while he may be a megastar today, when he first debuted in WWF back during the mid to late 90s, Dwayne Johnson was not quite so readily accepted by fans. And this led to a situation where he was turned on by live crowds almost as much as his cousin Roman Reigns would be decades later. Obviously then, this made for a great heel character when he formally turned to the side of villainy in 1997. And it was while in this villainous role that The Rock truly found himself as the most electrifying man in sports entertainment. What happened after that? Well, so good would Johnson be in this heel role, fans would eventually start to fall in love with him. And when they did, they'd love him so much that he'd become a megastar babyface, the likes of which is rarely seen. The only man who at the turn of the millennium could challenge Steve Austin for the spot of biggest star in the entire industry. So you'd think that now he was in this spot, The Rock would be a babyface for life, right? Wrong. Because this was a man of such talent, even if he was beloved beyond all measure, he could still get fans to hate him again at the drop of a hat. That's exactly how we got what was arguably his best career run when he became Hollywood Rock during the early 2000s. And it's also how we got the current role he's in today as the final boss, a megalomaniacal member of the TKO board who is only too happy to lord his power over anyone on the roster, in particular Cody Rhodes. Will we see him go full babyface again before all is said and done? Undoubtedly we will at some point. But let's move away from the men for a moment, because there are plenty of women out there too who have been just as good at playing the heel as they were the babyface inside of a wrestling ring. And few examples prove this more than our next subject, Lita. Of course, we all know how great of a babyface Lita was. After all, if you were watching during the Attitude Era and Ruthless Aggression Era, then it would have been impossible to miss this, as she always shone in the role when presented that way. And that's exactly what led her to become such a key part of Team Extreme during their heights, as well as a multiple-time women's champion. That said, not every run Amy Dumas had with the gold came when she was playing the role of hero. No, later in her career, she'd have a particularly notable run as a villain. And that all happened after her real life bled into the fiction of her character when, after her entanglement with Edge came to light, many fans turned on the new couple, as they instead put their support behind Matt Hardy. So realizing she was now being vilified then, Lita decided to lean into the whole thing and become the biggest heel the WWE Women's Division had seen in years. And whenever it was necessary for her to make returns in the years following her retirement, she's always been able to get the fans back on her side again, as she'd entered into feuds with performers such as Becky Lynch. That's right, all those years on, it seems live crowds have reverted back into falling in love with the Fort Lauderdale native, and with her now being in that Legends role, it means we'll likely see her remain a babyface for the rest of her days, just as she was when she was tearing it up with Matt and Jeff Hardy back in the day. Hell, we could even see her getting cheered ahead of someone like Rhea Ripley if they chose to enter into a program together. But then Lita isn't the only star that crossed over from the Attitude Era to the Ruthless Aggression Era who remains beloved today, despite them having more than a few spells as a dastardly heel during their full-time careers. No, the exact same statement could be applied to our next subject, one of the greatest of all time, whether he was a hero or a villain, Kurt Angle. Yes, no matter what role he was cast in throughout his career, he always delivered something special. Just go look at his initial run in WWF at the turn of the millennium as the delusional All-American babyface who was actually a heel in the eyes of fans. Seriously, this might still rank as the best rookie run the wrestling world has ever seen to this day. And because he was so good as the heel so early on, it shouldn't be surprising to learn that eventually fans came to love their Olympic hero, and after a while, he'd officially be turned babyface. Not that he'd be the babyface forever though, as whenever it was required of him, Kurt could always turn to the dark side once more at the tip of a hat, and be completely convincing in doing so, once again getting all those fans who'd been behind him to boo him some more. Really, it's a rare gift to be so great at every aspect of wrestling the way Kurt Angle was back during the 2000s. Hell, even when he left WWE behind in 2006 and didn't have the power of that machine behind him, he'd still be able to shine brightly as one of the best in the game over in TNA. And part of the reason he continued to succeed so much down in Nashville was because, just like with his time in WWE, he could be just as effective of a babyface as he was a heel, with him only needing to gauge the crowd to see what was required of him at that moment, and then act accordingly. Sure, you might be hard-pressed to find anyone who wants to boo Angle today, but then with him now retired, that's not really an issue he has to worry about anymore. No, all he has to do is sit back and watch the industry he left behind grow so much stronger because of his impact. But not everyone has to be considered the best ever to be a great heel and a great babyface. No, plenty of others have filled that role as well, as we've seen already today, and another great example can be found in our next subject, The Big Show. Yes, we know it's become something of a meme over the years that the Big Show's constant yo-yoing between being a good guy and a bad guy has verged on ridiculous, as sometimes it felt like it was impossible to keep up with what side of the alignment chart he stood on at any given time. But that should never suggest he wasn't very effective in both of those roles. No, the truth is Paul White's booking might have seen him overdo the face heel turns because he was so good at being whichever one WWE needed him to be depending on the situation. After all, we all remember how effective he was during his early days in WCW as a villain, and we all remember how much he shone when he later left the NWO and turned babyface. Then when he joined WWF in 1999, we all remember how much of an instant splash he made as the new enforcer of the corporation too, and we also remember how over he got a few years later when he once more left his villainous ways behind and returned to the side of the good guys. Hell, we even remember how great the Big Show could be later on in his career when he was at different times both a member of and thorn in the side to the Authority. And while AEW hasn't seen fit to turn him heel yet during his stint there, we can certainly picture a moment where the big man shows up and screws a babyface, once again shifting his allegiances in the process. So even if it is easy to joke about how wildly he's oscillated between good and bad over the years, never let it be forgotten that he has the ability to perform each of these roles to a high level. But what of someone who was a great rival to the Big Show back during the Attitude Era? Surely he deserves his own spot in this video too, right? Well, yes he does. And that's why our next subject is none other than the Big Boss Man. Yes, there are few who have ever played both a babyface and a heel as well as the Big Boss Man. After all, it was back during the late 80s when the golden era of WWF was still booming and children all over the world were spending their days watching Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage do their thing. It was decided that a new character should be brought into the fold of the WWF, one who served the role of law enforcement. And that was what led to Ray Traylor soon being brought in as the Cobb County-based corrections officer, the Big Boss Man. Sure, during those early months, the Boss Man might have been portrayed as more of a heel, but quickly he'd find himself on the side of all that was good as he formed a union of sorts with Hulk Hogan. And this turned the big man into one of the more popular acts on the roster almost overnight, someone over enough that he would hang around all the way up until 1993, at which point he jumped ship and joined WCW. What would he do in WCW? Well, there he'd mostly continue playing a face, though he would spend a brief period as a heel in 1996. And this all proved to be a taster for what was to come for him when he rejoined the WWF in 1998. That's right, this was the point where Traylor returned to WWF and, while technically still playing the same character of the Big Boss Man, would change things up in such a dramatic way that it barely even felt like the same character anymore. No, instead of this being the law enforcer who stood for everything that was good and true like he had done before, now the Boss Man was someone who wanted nothing more than to shape the law to his own needs and be as villainous as possible. And he would go so far with his bad guy side here that things quickly turned into a soap opera during infamous moments when he tormented the Big Show over the death of his father and fed Al Snow his own dog. Honestly, the truth is that when it came to playing a villain in the biggest, most cartoonish way possible, the Big Boss Man was able to do this better than almost anyone else at the turn of the millennium. And this means his heel run can easily match up to his earlier babyface run, but then the same could be said about everyone we've looked at today, as they're all examples of people who can be good or bad just as easily, depending on the circumstances.